Hi, good morning. My name is Ruben Abraham. I'm with the Milken Institute. And welcome to the session on India. We'll keep it snappy, we'll keep it interactive, so the last 15 minutes belongs to you. So feel free to jump in with questions, all of that stuff. We'll also try and keep it funny. And rules of the game are basically, I'll do about 40 minutes of Q&A with the panel, and then open it out to the audience. I'm not going to do introductions because all of you know who's on the panel. But I couldn't find a panel that was better suited to discuss the emergence of India. So, Alyssa, let me start with you. You've just written this book, well, there's the book, which actually explains India to an American audience.
Right.
Right? What in your view, especially given wear your former hat as well as a diplomat, of India's role in the world? I mean, do you see India as a leading power, a balancing power? How does the US establishment perceive this?
Well, I can't speak for the present US establishment, obviously.
The deep state. How does the deep state
And I don't believe there
perceive
is a deep state. But let me try to offer how I see this issue. I mean, India has had ambitions for decades to be seen as a global power by virtue of its size, by virtue of the fact that India has maintained democracy in many ways against the odds over decades. But India has also struggled with a lot of domestic issues that I think we all know about. Anybody who picks up a newspaper can read about India's many domestic challenges. But what you do see happening now is an emergence of India, not only as a major economy. It is entirely possible that this year the Indian economy could overtake the size of the economies of France and the UK at market exchange rates to become the world's 5th largest economy. But you are also seeing India step up in ways that are taking it out of being a defensive power or a balancing power on the world stage. You see India willing to stand up and show leadership when in the past it might have been more focused on being quiet or trying not to offend important other partner countries in the world. I see this emergence of India as a leading power as a very important moment for us, and so that's a lot of what I've written about in the book.
Okay. One of the things you mention in the book is a thought experiment by Larry Summers.
Right.
Which is basically looking back 300 years. What would you actually notice? So if you look back 200 years from now, or today if you look back 200 years, I mean, what are the big things that stand out? And so Larry Summers makes this point about the emergence of India and China being the sort of standout things that you'd remember from this era. But for some reason, that doesn't seem to be registering, right? And there was also a time when the emergence of China was also underplayed in the US in a big way. And today you are seeing the emergence of India as actually being underplayed. So as you said, I mean, this year, 5th largest economy. If you just stay at 7%, it becomes the 3rd largest economy in the next 10 years. Why aren't people paying more attention?
I think there's a couple explanations for this. One of which is the fact that India is not a crisis.
Yep.
There's no North Korea crisis for India with us in Washington, so there's not a kind of immediate need to focus on some big problem. India is a long-term strategic partner. Its emergence on the world stage is unfolding in its own way. It's not like a traditional United States ally, so not a crisis, also not a traditional ally with the kind of structures for dialogue and engagement that exist with allies the United States has worked with for years. But you also see what's unfolding in India taking place against the backdrop of very significant domestic challenges. So India may be becoming a net provider of regional security and a more important defense actor across the Indian Ocean region, but it still has a lot of problems at home. And I think very often it's difficult for people who don't follow the country closely to see past the many domestic vulnerabilities and also appreciate that while India does have challenges of poverty, of various forms of discrimination at home, it is also doing new and different things on the world stage at the same time.
Nisha, do you want to pick up on some of this? Also build in your experience at State.
Sure. Thank you, Ruben. Listen, I do think that people are paying attention. The question is who? Is it the U.S. media? Is it the U.S. media, I think, tends to be a little bit behind the curve in terms of when they finally focus and pick up on it, because all of the things that Alyssa mentioned in terms of crises and major world events and things that dominate the headlines, right? If it bleeds, it leads, and India is certainly not bleeding. But I do think that the business community are paying attention and are really focused on the opportunity that India represents. And I think increasingly the world is paying attention, and I think the political establishment is paying attention. Certainly the one that Alyssa and I were a part of in terms of the administration that we both served in, but also the current administration. You're seeing a great deal of prioritization of India in recognition of the opportunity that it represents strategically and economically. But India is a country that is kind of in transition and on the rise. And so the world's expectations of India are still catching up to the reality of India. And then one final point on the domestic challenges, which are certainly significant, but then, you know, where in the world do we not see significant domestic challenges right now of the nature, you know, whether you're talking about issues of governance capacity, whether you're talking about nationalism or protectionism or you know, the tensions between the classes, et cetera. This is a world in transition as well, as the backlashes of globalization are increasingly manifest in both emerging and established economies.
Okay. Seema, let me come to you. You left India a long time ago, but J&J obviously has a largish presence in India. Looking back from where you sit now, what are the big opportunities? What are the big positives that you see in India?
Yeah, so I left India a long time ago, as you say, and when I left India, we had maybe just 2 television stations, Doordarshan 1 and Doordarshan 2, run by the Indian government. There were very few landlines. I mean, cell phones were not even there. And so, in fact, if you wanted to make a call, you had to book a call at an STD station and go make a call. Poverty, you know, was everywhere. Literacy was very low. Opportunities for education were there were only 5 IITs, and so if you got into one of those IITs, then you were gold. Otherwise, you know, it was very hard to get a good education to compete. And of course, with the closed sort of trade policy and all of that, it was just a quote unquote third world poor country. And today, at age 70, India is coming of age. And so when I go back there now, and by the way, the only car, and very few cars, and that was the Ambassador car that we had. And then now you go back to India, and to see the vibrancy, to see that you can actually believe that it is one of the fastest growing economies, and probably will become only second to China by 2025. So the positives are that a lot of progress has been made, I think, in terms of literacy, increased literacy, life expectancy has increased. Poverty line, the number of people below poverty line has also gotten less. So I think it's poised for growth. If you think about from a science and technology and innovation perspective, $77 billion invested, and India is leading in many industries. The mission to Mars, and then the generics industry in India is just fantastic from an innovation standpoint. It's second to none. So you can make actually medications cheaper than you could, and therefore all of the poorer countries are able to afford medications because of that. So the transformation has just been phenomenal. But I think we're at an inflection point. And the inflection point, I think you could, based on what decisions you make, could either turn it into a global driver or continue to face the challenges that it continues to face.
So what would that look like?
So there are so many things that could be done. I mean, corruption, is one of the biggest reasons why businesses are not able to, set up. And that affects, a lot of progress has been made in that arena as well. So I could go, the list is quite a few, but there are 2 things that I'm very passionate about. So India's biggest positive, of course, is the demographic dividend, right? 1.3 billion people, 18% of the world's population. And if you think about it, the number of youths, half of India's population is under 25, so that's youth. And if you're able to empower them, and if you're able to, they could create a future for India and a future, perhaps even a digital economy for India that is unlike any other, and create a new model. And then the abysmal thing about where the missed opportunity, a lot of money left on the table, is the participation of women in the workforce. So we are behind Yemen, India, in terms of women's participation in the workforce. We are actually 135th among the 147 nations in terms of, if you look at Asia Pac just in general. Again, our numbers are really not good. So I think a recent study in last month showed that if you could increase women's participation in India in the labor workforce and increase the status of women, then you could add about $770 billion in GDP by 2025. So that's the opportunity cost of not including women. So inclusion and inclusive growth is a big challenge.
So on the point about women, there's been some very interesting research that has showed that as India took off, growth began to get towards 8-9%, women's participation actually went down.
Absolutely, yes.
Do you have a hypothesis here?
I think it's an inherent bias against women that has been part of a cultural challenge, and I think that there is a lot of progress. Again, I don't want to paint a very bad picture, but I think we need ambassadors, both women ambassadors as well as male ambassadors, man-ambassadors, because these man-ambassadors are going to be key to also enabling and opening up the doors for women. Women's empowerment is required. And then one last thing I'll say about that is that there are pockets of excellence. So if you look at some Indian women in politics, Indian women in space research, Indian women in IT, Indian women in finance, there are pockets of excellence, but the question is how can you scale that? And how can you reach all of the other women who are left behind?
Well, on this panel, we've made a modest beginning.
Yes.
We have more women speakers than men.
Equal opportunity.
No, I'm a moderator. I exclude myself. I just want to pick up on the demographic dividend point because both of you are keen observers of the domestic political scene in India. So the problem with the demographic dividend is that the average for India actually hides other stuff. So the problem here is that the average Bihari is 19 years old. The average Tamilian is 31 years old. Who are you making policy for? Right? How do you get around that particular problem?
No, I think you touch upon a really important point, which is that you can't look at India just as a monolith. You've got to break it down because India is such a massive country with so much diversity and disparity in that states are growing at different rates. Literacy is not monolithic. Women's participation is not monolithic. If you look at Kerala, women's participation in the economy is going to look very different than if you look at UP. And so you've got to be able to break it down. India as a governance challenge also has to be broken down and disaggregated because governance is going to be different as you look at the different pieces of the pie, of the geography. And then you have to look at, break down the demographics. You were talking about women's participation. If you look at the economics of that, what I think you'll find is that women's participation at the very lowest rungs amongst kind of the laborer class is going to be higher because of poverty and the need. And then if you look at the very high ranks of the elites and the educated. But what's missing is the middle. And that's where the challenge is the vast middle class, upper lower income and lower middle income. Where is the opportunity and the focus on women in that segment of the economy? And that's where I think you have to kind of try to break through. So a lot of India's challenge is disaggregating the problem set and focusing on more manageable pieces of the pie in terms of where and how you try to make an impact rather than as a monolith. And that's why, for example, at the U.S.-India Business Council, we're focusing so much on state and local engagement because that's really where both the opportunities are and where the challenges that need to be met can be best met.
I think that's the challenge with India is India sometimes, at least from the outside in, seems to defy definition. It's like, blind men and the elephant. One person feels the tail, one person feels the trunk, and one person feels the ears, and different people have different descriptions of India because it's so diverse, as you say. And I think that's part of the challenge of really defining India. It's a study in contrasts.
So, Alyssa, do you want to comment on this? Because both of them are talking about the view from the outside in. So when you're from the outside in, yes, you need to disaggregate the country, et cetera, et cetera. But inside, there's still a governance challenge, right? I mean, you have these huge disparities. You've got the average Tamilian being 4 times richer than the average. So, there was once this famous quote by Rajagopalachari, our first Governor General, who basically made this point of do not conflate unity with uniformity. And oftentimes in India, there is this idea of uniformity being a proxy for unity. But so is a better way of governance a deep federation that it needs to move towards?
In
A
many ways,
United
it's
States of
moving
India?
to that direction. I mean, fiscal decentralization, this has been advanced. It actually has not trickled down to the municipal, to the city level. That remains a governance issue, a kind of governance outlier in India. But you do see greater decentralization taking place, and you see states seeing themselves as a unit of interaction in a way that is becoming much more important to the kinds of conversations that take place internally about governance reform. In India.
Not to mention the fact that a lot of the governance and policy reforms can only be undertaken by the
By
states.
the states.
Yeah.
That's right.
Sorry, I'll come back to the city question in just a bit. I know you want to.
We
touch
should
on
let the men get a word in
exactly.
edgewise.
No, the men simply aren't getting a word in.
I
Right.
just want to make a quick point that I think some of the challenges we've spoken about in terms of some geographical regions progressing slowly is really maybe just an exaggerated example of what is happening in other parts of the world as well, right? I mean, I'm based in London now, and if you look at it, this is a constant dialogue in the UK around how, London, the economy in London is not representative of what's happening in the UK as a whole. You have this whole challenge of coastal versus non-coastal regions in China.
Yeah.
You have the same issues, really, probably with the exception of maybe Germany and France.
But even Germany is east and west, right?
But in almost every major country in the world, including in the US, which had such a huge impact on the elections as well.
So
That's a
I-
great
I
point.
actually had a counterpoint on this one.
Yeah.
So we study the Indian consumer in with a sort of a blank slate. We really are a country which is data dark in some ways, especially when it comes to consumers. And so we have to do our own studies. And what we've figured out, and for those of you who don't know, I run a beer startup in India.
we'll come to that.
We'll come to that, okay. But the counterpoint that I wanted to make was we actually looked at the premium beer market in a very diverse set of markets in India. And the typical sort of conventional wisdom that gets sort of propagated in India is there's some cities that are very, very beer centric. So if you go to a Bangalore, that's beer city, and Mumbai has a genuine beer culture, and Calcutta has some of that, and maybe Delhi does not. But when we looked at the data, and when we looked at the per capita consumption of premium beer in India across major metropolitan regions, per capita consumption was equal to the third decimal place in every tier 1 city that we studied, which was completely counterintuitive to us. So for me, I think when I look at the market, it is much more not north versus south versus or east versus west. It is really at the economic level at which each of these clusters or geographies are at. So, and the exact same thing repeated when we looked at a tier 2 city, when we looked at a tier 3 city. So the patterns of consumption are very similar to the level of economic growth.
So what you're basically saying is India is a nation of alcoholics. That's a good thing,
Beer
good
drinkers,
takeaway.
maybe.
Beer drinkers, not alcoholics, exactly. Mohit, let me come to you. Now you've spent, what is it, 20 plus years now at Infosys?
17 years.
17
Yeah, I know
years.
it feels like 20, but it's only 17.
Yeah, okay. So you've been at Infosys for a very long time, and in many ways, Infosys is the bellwether, right? I mean, Infosys has always been considered to be a proxy
Yeah.
for India. I mean, tell us, I'm guessing there are people in the audience who actually don't know the Infosys story. I mean, tell us about the story of Infosys, because it's actually a very good proxy for the story of India.
So I think, look, the Infosys story itself is, goes back to 81, when you had a set of 7 founders starting the company. But really, the growth of the company only started in '91, right, after liberalization.
After you joined.
He can't do his math. Don't believe his data any longer.
I joined in 2000,
2000.
but see, in 2000 also, this was around a $180 million company, right? And now we're $11 billion plus in revenue. So over a very short span of time, you've seen a rapid growth in the company. The company has grown from 10,000 people or so, maybe 6,000 people or so in 2000 to over 200,000 people now. More than 95% of our revenue is global. We have 200,000 employees across the world. We've just made a commitment to hire 11,000 more people in the US over the next few years. So the company has gone global with a vengeance, right? And the whole sector, the whole IT services sector, is now the largest employment generator in the organized sector in India. It is the single largest component of exports for the country, and it really has presented a different perspective or a different picture of of a country, where previously bulk of the exports used to be raw material or coal or finished leather products to high technology. I feel is a dramatic change.
Yeah.
The next pivot obviously is how do you start building intellectual property within these companies? How do you start monetizing the intellectual property that individuals and companies can create? And at another level, we've been talking about the growth of Infosys, so the growth of these companies, which is very important because you've created a lot of jobs, you've created a huge amount of wealth for investors. But I also feel it's created a gigantic talent pool and a different way of working in the company. And the million plus people who work in the sector now are now going on to start one of the largest startup ecosystems in the world in Bangalore. The million plus people who work in the sector work in a very different way from the traditional organized companies. So Seema was talking about the fact that the representation of women in companies is still relatively low. But if I look at Infosys, at the entry level, more than 50% of our fresh engineers that we hire are women. And as they traverse, as their journey continues in the company, these are the leaders of tomorrow. So
is it a leaky pipeline though?
There is.
Do they drop off?
There
at
is.
some
There
point?
is. So
Yeah.
and that's something that we're working on. So as you see in the U.S. or other markets, typically when women have children, this is when we see a drop off. And so what we've started to do now is to be able to offer the sort of support system, which is available commercially in other countries, right? So for instance, you have creches and you have nurseries and you have childcare in many countries. In India, historically, these things were done by the family. And so now we've had to create these services for our employees so that we're able to retain them, even after they've had children, or create a pathway for them to come back, to the company, maybe after taking a few years break, in such a way that it doesn't really disrupt their long-term career trajectory. So, again, just to summarize, the Infosys journey itself is incredibly important. And we've created, I think, a world-class, a world-scale, technology organization. But more importantly, I think what we've been able to do is to create, a whole new ecosystem of talent, and to create a whole new way of working, a whole new way of, of looking at corporate disclosure, of looking at governance standards within an organization. So to create the infrastructure for many, many more world-class companies to come out.
So there's a couple of other things that emerged out of Infosys that you probably are not touching on, which is the culture of entrepreneurship.
Yes.
I mean, it was nobody ever thought you could do business clean or relatively
That's true.
clean and create a giant company. So
Yeah.
in many ways, these guys have just become the standard bearers and opened the gates
Yeah.
for a whole bunch of people to consider entrepreneurship as an opportunity where you could make money clean.
No, absolutely. I think that's a very valid point. I think this was really the first company where you had 7 middle-class professionals pooling together maybe $200 of seed capital to create a company, which now has a $40 billion market cap. 30 plus years later, but also because they had no connections on which to draw on within the country, and because at that time, if you look at it from a US perspective, or from an international capital markets perspective. People were very reluctant to invest in India because they were afraid about, are the promoters going to be siphoning money out from the company? Are disclosure standards high enough for us to be able to invest? And so creating that story or that narrative, for the investors was very important. It was also very important to create the physical infrastructure, right? Because you're living, you're growing up in a country where you don't really have corporate parks, you really don't have world-class office space, and so, creating that, 10 million plus square feet of really world-class office space, of creating global standard amenities for, for your employees was again a second part of this. And then when you had this, right, when you had, maybe 500,000 people have passed through Infosys over the past 30 years. These are 500,000 people who've seen really world-class financial reporting and disclosure and corporate citizenship, and who've had access to a world-class infrastructure. So when they're going on and creating their own companies, they're obviously, influenced.
It's like the software
Yeah,
of
it's
management.
not-
Or learning from
Yeah.
this, right? And that's important. And then the third piece, which I think we'll be covering later, is around the role that that companies like ours have also had in creating this whole India stack, right? Which I think is going to be tremendously important.
Let's come back to India Stack for a second. I just want you to address one of the criticisms of the IT
Sure.
industry, which is that it's still playing a very sort of low value game.
Yes.
And what does that journey look like? I mean, is the move to high value happening, or
Yes.
is there just too much of a market at the low value that needs to be captured first?
No, look, I think I think the move to high value is happening, and it's happening partly because that is the direction that we want to take as a company.
Yeah.
In the work that we're doing is incredibly central and core to our clients and to their future journey. It's also the way the market is moving, right? If you look at it, IBM is now a larger employer in India than we are. Accenture is a very large employer. So we've had to pivot our model, to cater to the more disruptive technologies, to cater to digital, and I would say that we're doing it very successfully. One of the challenges of being sort of, the poster boy for growth in India also is that expectations are incredibly high. But if you look at it, the revenue per employee, for instance, that we generate, which is a true measure of the economic value add that we do, that measure has been growing steadily for the past, 20 years, which is a reflection of the bill rate. So the higher bill rates reflect the confidence from the clients that you're adding more value. So I feel it is changing. I feel that there is really very little to distinguish us from our global peers in terms of the work that we do or the value that we add to our clients. The one space where, again, growth has been somewhat limited has been in the product space, creating intellectual property and therefore getting license revenue. But I don't think that's a long-term problem, because in the long run, software companies are moving away from license revenue models, right? Everybody is moving towards a model of software plus services, or towards a subscription-based model. And I feel that our heritage in terms of, really deep understanding of clients and, a diverse client base, a diverse technology base, really positions us really well to capture that market, as opposed to a pure software license model, which in any case is on a decline.
So let me ask you one final question about the industry. What's the outlook? It's what, $160 billion now?
I think, if you look at the industry, plus you look at the work that is being done out of the sort of so-called captive centers in India, it's probably closer to $250 to $300 billion. I feel that the outlook for the industry is really very positive, it's very rosy. And the reason I say this, right, is because at the end of the day, the demand for our services is a derived demand. It's derived from the spend that the top 2,000 corporations in the world have on technology. And I have not met a single company in the past 17 years that intends to spend less on technology the next year than they did the previous year. We do a lot of work with banks that's core to my own personal work. Banks used to spend about 1 to 2% of their revenue on technology. Most banks are now spending 5 to 7% of the revenue on technology. So as the spend on technology, as the spend on digital, as the spend on automation and AI goes up, that is, because that is our core demand, the future for the industry is bright. Obviously, we need to tinker with our model, right? We need to change our model. We need to be a lot more local in all the geographies in which we operate. So, for instance, we're setting up a 140-acre training campus in the U.S. in Indianapolis. We're looking to invest in new and cutting-edge technologies. But if we're able to pivot the model, if the industry is able to pivot the model, I feel that it is not a mature industry by any sense of imagination.
Okay. Ankur, coming to you. So I think Milken had put out a tweet about this panel yesterday, and the Financial Times correspondent in India, Amy Casman, picked it up and saying, "What's a beer brand doing on an economic panel?" Tell us, what is a beer brand doing on a panel on economic?
Well,
why do brands like Bira matter?
Well,
so hold on.
Yeah.
So I remember in 2007 sitting
Yeah.
in a bar in
Yes.
New York with you.
Yes.
And he told me he wanted to bring Trappist ales into India. And I was like, this guy is nuts. He's certifiably nuts. He's now created the fastest growing beer brand in the country. Tell us the story.
Probably in the world at this point. But essentially, I would first of all argue that beer is appropriate for every occasion, including an economic panel at the Milken Institute.
Fantastic.
I can drink to that.
And no, but more seriously, I think we think of ourselves as representing the Indian consumer. I think beer happens to be one of those categories which is relatively accessible. And there's this huge transition towards flavor that's happening worldwide in categories. And it's a staple, right? It's a staple across the world. It's sort of emerging in India. It's a large consumer product category. And what we've been able to build over the last 3 years, we started about 3 years ago with our brand, is a $100 million brand today, which is testament not to our success per se, but more to how the consumer, the Indian consumer, is willing to transition towards new brands, towards beer, towards products that have more flavor, but also how the Indian consumer is premiumizing, and not just at a small scale. It's not a niche product. It is percolating consumer culture in a very deep manner. So one is that. The second aspect is typically when you think of India, and when you think of India from with the lens of what is happening in India from a business standpoint, you think of companies like Infosys, you think of companies which are tech-oriented and so on. And I think we sort of represent different sort of angle with respect to Indian startups, where there are companies like ours which are not just, first of all, speaking to the Indian consumer from a very sort of visceral perspective. Everything that we end up doing in the brick and mortar world, whether it is food and beverage companies or elsewhere, is extremely visceral and personal, and almost informs identity. But also, it is the first time that we see Indian startups trying to step out of India and create global brands. And I'll sort of come back to the top of the panel where Alyssa mentioned as to how India is sort of trying to, from a policy standpoint, trying to step out and take its place in the global landscape. And I think the software aspect of this is Bira 91, or companies or brands like Bira 91, where we're trying to also build the first global brands in the lifestyle space, in the consumer space, to come out of India, which has never happened in the past before.
Mm-hmm. So you were the official partner of the Tribeca Film Festival.
We were the official partner of the Tribeca Film Festival.
So why does the US matter to you? I mean, there's clearly a big market in India. What are you doing selling beers in the US?
So I think, again, well, as I said, every location's
yeah, but
this
is a furiously competitive market.
It is a furiously competitive market. And I think I get this a lot, and we're sort of venture backed. And
so you're basically using California pension money.
But no, that too. But I can safely attest that there's nobody on my cap table who I have not fought with to be operating in the U.S. So there's very few believers, even within our company, with respect to the possibility of an Indian brand trying to emerge on the global landscape. And I think that's the reason why we are there in the US, because we see our place over the next 5, 10, 20 years as a brand that could have an equal chance to redefine the category. So when I think about companies out of India or companies out of anywhere, I constantly think about, where are the Apples of India? Where are the Nikes of India? Where are the companies that truly define a category.
Right.
And I think that's what's happening in the Indian startup ecosystem today.
Right. So some of the product companies that Mohit was mentioning may actually come out of left field.
Absolutely.
Where you're not expecting it at all.
Right.
Can I come back to the two of you? So this is a very sort of rosy picture that we're painting. At USIBC, you have a ringside sort of view of the environment in India, especially US business in India. What's the view? I mean, have things improved? What are the big stumbling blocks? What should any prospective business that's thinking about India, what should they care about? Besides the very, very useful point that you mentioned, which is disaggregate the country.
Well, certainly, look, there is both a very sunny side of the street where you can see all of the things that have improved, that have changed, that are moving in the right direction. And I think we've enumerated a number of those, but you can talk about the fact that you are seeing this massive amount of FDI that is starting to go in, and you're starting to see the improvements in corporate governance and in the ease of doing business, but there are still many gaps that need to be addressed. And in fact, I would say that the regulatory structure of India is still catching up to the reality of and the requirements of a modern economy. And this is something, Ruben, that you and I have talked about in the past, which is that layering on of regulations without clearing the underbrush means that you have just kind of this labyrinthine process, and you don't have regulatory efficiency in terms of what is governing the investments coming in. So that creates a lot of challenges. You end up having to address these challenges on a case-by-case basis. And so you have people in the Indian government who are very good at helping companies, especially the big investors, navigate those challenges and help solve problems. But you don't have the transparency and efficiency that allows a massive amount of SMEs to come in.
Yep.
And that keeps a lot of investment out. So why is it that you have about 500 or 600 big American companies that have significant investment in India when it ought to be 5,000 or 6,000, right? Why is it that two-way trade is at about 115 billion, which is still very, high from the low base it was at 10 years ago? But we're at over 600 billion with China. So how do we get there, right? And you've got to deal with all that underbrush. You've got to deal with capacity gaps. For a country that has a massive labor pool, there's still a significant gap in skilled workers across virtually every industry. And so how do you deal with education and skilling? How do you deal with building the capacity of bureaucrats and regulators? One of the things that the United States gets criticized for, but which I actually think is a huge strength, is that revolving door between industry and government, because it refreshes the software. It brings best practices. It brings understanding. It's very hard to do in India. So you have regulators and you have bureaucrats who have kind of a firewall with industry, and that means that you don't understand the needs of industry.
And they haven't spent a day in industry.
And they haven't spent a day in industry. So these are all challenges that I think are large, and they're systemic, and they need to be broken down. At the same time, things are happening, but this could actually create a pathway, an accelerator for India's economy if these critical issues could be addressed.
So equally, one of the issues, I suppose it's implicit in what you're saying, is the capacity of the state. So one part of it is knowing what to do and why you need to do it, and the other is actually doing it. So if you talk to a lot of big investors and so on, I mean, their biggest problem is there's a massive execution deficit.
Right.
There's this huge transmission loss between the policy layer and the execution layer.
Right.
Right? And unfortunately, the state is just not large enough. I mean, in fact, or rather, let's put it differently. The Indian state is large, but the policy-making level of the Indian state is very minimal. So our foreign service is basically the size of Singapore's foreign service.
Yeah. It's size, but it's also, the ability of the bureaucracy to learn and to reinvent and to modernize. If you silo it, and you wall it off from the rest of society, then you're regulating to the needs of 10 years ago, not 10 years down the road. And that's a challenge for India, is how do you refresh that software?
Well, there's the additional problem of how do you get the executive, the bureaucracy, to take on risk.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
I mean,
that's a
without
problem the world
politics,
over.
it's all
but-
over. I mean, the
Yeah.
British created a TV series, Yes Minister, just on this basis. So, Alyssa, do you want to jump in on this, on the issues around the big sort of stumbling blocks and how to get around it?
Well, I mean, there are many different stumbling blocks, and it depends on what industry somebody's in and what type of a company they're trying to lead. And I think the fact that the Foreign Direct Investment Manual is more than 100 pages sort
Right.
of illustrates what Nisha
So
was
let me-
saying, a sort
so let me
of
ask you
case by case.
A sort of different question then.
Yeah.
So clearly, India, along with China, has probably been one of the biggest beneficiaries of a open trading system, globalization, et cetera, et cetera. Why is there still the suspicion of all of the things that have actually made India into what it is today?
I wish I had a clear answer for that. Actually, I think this is one of the big mysteries, that India, which has historically been a very open trading country, which has now benefited from a world trading system, continues to, in many ways, worry about foreign capital and the influence of things foreign on the domestic economy and domestic social issues, where in many ways actually India shouldn't worry about these things.
Right.
You see Indian companies becoming very global and going out on the world stage and playing that sort of private sector leadership role.
Yeah.
And yet very often, and sometimes specific sectors will have a trigger to it. For example, the free basics debate that took
Yeah,
place,
sure.
where people talked about the idea of free basics as a East India company all over again. Well, there's a lot of trade and openness and flow of economic exchange, and India is playing a big part in that too.
Go
But
ahead.
if you think about it, the politics of trade the world over,
It's tricky.
it's tricky, and it reflects the same thing, which is that the effects of free trade, the effects of globalization are large, but they're diffuse. And the effects, the displacements and dislocation
How concentrated?
are concentrated. And so you have very vocal, disenfranchised minorities that tend to drive the political conversation, and very disengaged large majorities that tend to not engage on these issues and not advocate. So if you look in India and say, who are the constituents and the advocates for free trade, they're hard to find. But that's also true to some extent in the United States, which is that you're hearing more and more of the backlash of those dislocated, disenfranchised, or disadvantaged by free trade, whose voices are drowning out what has been a fairly robust voice in the United States from industry on the benefits of free trade.
We are losing that middle in the U.S. now.
Ankur, on picking up on the ease of doing business point out here. So, you're a startup, perhaps you're no longer a startup, and I'm sure you don't want to be described as manufacturing, but in some ways, by virtue of running a brewery, et cetera, what has your experience been like in dealing with the regulatory red tape, et cetera, as a business of the, in the alcohol industry, which is severely regulated?
I think it really depends on the time frame that you're looking at. In the short term, everything seems to be very detrimental. But when you look at it with the horizon of a decade, and I've been sort of involved with the beer sector for almost 9 or 10 years now, you see multiple areas of progress. From a licensing perspective, the fact that there's differentiation between beer and spirits, for example. And our trade is, of course, very heavily regulated, not just by the central government, but also by the state governments. However, I think the one point that I always make, and I meet a lot of government officials at the state levels, is the policy in India is usually a few years behind what consumers want. So it takes governance or policy making time to catch up to what consumers want and are demanding, but eventually it happens, and if it doesn't, then it's unsustainable. Case in point is prohibition in a few states that are being talked about. Every election cycle you would see a couple of states or political parties that make a campaign issue out of it. One of them, in fact, went to an extreme situation, Bihar, which announced prohibition right after the challenger won the election. And or was the incumbent actually, who won the election, but was one of his campaign promises. And you see the effects of that and how unsustainable that is, where sort of deaths because of spurious liquor and so on have increased, and there's tremendous expansion of drug use in the state because of that prohibition. And so that it completely becomes unsustainable. So the average length of a prohibition in India, and there's been at least 30 or 40 instances where state governments have tried it out. The average length of prohibition in India, outside of the state of Gujarat, has been exactly 14 months. And so
you can't keep an Indian away from his booze.
absolutely. Right.
Mohit, your former boss,
Yes.
London.
And now current boss as well. He's back as the
Yeah,
chairman.
he's back as your chairman. That's true. I mean, all Infosys employees like to think that Infosys was his greatest creation, but most Indians would claim that
I agree.
his role after Infosys is actually what is a
Yes.
complete game changer. Walk us through what he did. Walk us through India Stack.
Sure.
What is India Stack? I mean, this is path-breaking stuff.
Sure. So I think, look, the India Stack story is actually very remarkable. And if you look at it from the perspective for the next 10 to 15 years, this has A, the potential to add about 1% to the GDP growth every single year at the very least. And B, I think it's a representative model for what a software stack for citizen services and for businesses should look like. So in the sense, it is very amenable for for export. We've looked at a lot of countries, and I can't think of a single country where you've got such a well-defined, low-cost, highly scalable software model for effectively how to run citizen services in a country. I was trying to think of the appropriate analogy for this, and you looking at India coming from a sort of a colonial background with sort of the British background in rationing, where the only way that you could prove your identity was through a ration card. And the only analogy I could think of was The Wizard of Oz, where in the movie, in the first 20 minutes, you suddenly go from black and white to like deep color, right? And this is how the whole model for citizen services in India is evolving. So the India software stack, for those of you who don't know it, has 3 or 4 key components. The first is the biometric identification component. So you've got 1.18 or 1.2 billion people in India who now have their biometric identities in terms of photographs, retina scans, and fingerprints stored with the government, and you can use that that basic information to be able to authenticate yourself. So the authentication layer is the basic layer of the stack. On top of that, you've been able to build a unified payment interface stack. So you can transfer money from one individual to the other across banks without using the credit card rails. And this has been so successful that in the past 18 months, the UPI layer, or the Unified Payment Interface layer, has only been in place for 18 months. And in 18 months, it already does more volume than the credit card companies, than a Master or Visa, that have been there for 2 decades plus. So that's the second part of the layer. The third part of the layer is the new tax system, right? The new tax software, GST. So what happens in GST is that if I'm a small business, I'm able to upload invoices of my activity onto the GST system, and then get input credits based on on who I sell it to. And so at one stroke, I'm able to prove to a lender that this is my business, this is who I sell to, and so I have very clearly identifiable data on every business. There are 10 million companies already on the tax system. So this is almost every company in the organized and even semi-organized sector in India. And this entire stack has been built over the past 6 to 10 years. So it is truly remarkable that this stack is now, and on top of this, there's a new consent stack to be built, right? So I can now, as an individual or as a company, decide to share my data with lenders. And if the panel has spoken about the challenges in terms of India, 2 things really come out, right? One is corruption, right? Which is you've had corruption at every level. You've had a lot of leakages at multiple levels because you've got several intermediaries or middlemen. This now allows you to completely bypass the middlemen. So direct benefit transfer allows for the government to make, in over 200 categories, direct payments to individuals to their bank accounts. The GST stack allows for businesses to be able to borrow more. So the second challenge after corruption in India has been the very low level of credit penetration, because you haven't had data to lend to anybody except the largest companies and salaried employees. Now you've got data on individuals, on Uber drivers and taxi drivers and small shopkeepers and their businesses. So businesses are able to lend aggressively. More than 100 new lending companies have come up in India just in the past 1 year that are now using these algorithms, that are now using the data available to lend. So it is it is almost a complete transformation in terms of making India into a data-rich environment, and based on the data, you can make decisions. The other piece is that it's almost a virtuous cycle, right? If you look at, and Seema spoke about tele-density, right? So about 20 years ago, you had a tele-density of about 30 to 35% in India. It's now 93%. You look at data usage, India is now the largest market in the world for mobile data usage. So you're seeing this huge shift, and I would argue that it's partly driven by the fact that you have this India government stack now that most individuals and businesses have to use. It is truly transformational in what it can do through the economy. And I would say that you ain't seen anything yet. If you look at the US, right, when you build the infrastructure for the internet, nobody could really predict that 20 or 30 years ago or later that you'd be building huge apps and huge businesses and supply chains and lending chains on this basic infrastructure. And I feel that the India stack now allows us to build the same level of apps and supply chains and lending businesses based on the stack. So I feel that it will be over the next 15 to 20 years, this is going to drive a systemic and a structured level of growth in GDP, because you now have the underpinnings of a very robust system. So it's almost moved from a system where you had no data to a situation where it is going to be now the richest economy in terms of data on individuals and companies.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to questions, but you wanted to make a point about data and consent.
I just want to jump in that this is such a massive, massive pivotal moment for India and how it's going to impact its economy. But that's why the governance frame around data privacy is going to be so critical. And this is one of the big issues that I think both Indian companies and global companies investing in India are extremely focused on. How is India going to navigate that space? And we're all obviously aware of all the headlines in the US and around the world on the issues of data. And is India going to follow the model of China? Is it going to follow the regulatory model of the EU? Or is there an opportunity here for India to kind of chart its own path and maybe become the creator of the norms for the Indo-Pacific on data? And that's what we're hoping that India moves towards.
So for those of you in the room who are interested, this consent architecture that Mohit was talking about is now evolving into something called the Digital Empowerment and Protection Act, DIPA. It is probably the best consent architecture anywhere in the world. It's, in my opinion, better than what they're about to propose in Europe, the GDPR. So if you're interested, you should look it up. I'll open it up to questions. If you can just identify yourself and make it short and snappy. Yes, sir.
Steve Bray.
Sorry, the mic is here. If you have questions, just put your hands up. It'll be just easier to.
Steve Bray from Power Plus. Just came back from a 2-week scouting trip in India. And the thing that's a little daunting for a small company to, open an office and see all the opportunity there is the corruption and the language barriers, and you can travel across state and almost feel like you're in a completely different country. Can you speak to that? I mean, so if I go there, do I need an Indian partner to navigate that, or do I need, is there some agency, is there some way to, work my way through that process?
I give you USIBC. Sorry.
It's a tailor-made question.
Exactly, and certainly we should talk afterwards to see what we can do to support you. But the truth is that for small companies, it remains difficult to navigate that. Now the government is trying to move more and more into a digital e-governance architecture that makes it easier, that starts to move towards single window, but they are nowhere near single window right now. DIPP does, which is the Department of Investment,
Promotion,
Industrial Promotion, tries to play a little bit of that role to help create kind of the red carpet rather than the red tape, as Prime Minister Modi likes to talk about. And I'm surprised none of us have really talked about Narendra Modi and his impact on India over the past 5 years. But you know, that mentality of trying to create a little bit easier pathway, glide path for investment coming in is there, but it's harder, much harder for the smaller companies. And there are a host of others who are helping to try to meet that space. Certainly India-based partners, but doing your due diligence on picking a partner is also really, really important and can become crippling if you choose the wrong partner. So still a challenge.
Personally, my training ground was New York City, by the way. So I would recommend New York City a lot.
Any other questions? Yeah, please. The mic's just coming, sorry.
So my company is Virgin Hyperloop One, and so we're actually looking at starting up a route between Mumbai and Pune, and we have a feasibility study underway. And the interesting thing is, I think sometimes it's a perception problem. So we're not really having any problem from the perspective of forming a consortium and working with partners, but there was almost a perception on the U.S. side that India is too difficult to work with, and there's so much corruption, and there's this and that. So is there anything that can be done, maybe from the business council side, to do something to fix that perception? Because I personally, as an Indian person, are not having a problem setting up our small company operation there, but there is this perception that exists, which I think is a large reason why perhaps people aren't investing as much as they should.
You know, if you read the New York Times, you will be intimately aware of all of the problems of India. But if you only come away from the New York Times of awareness of all of the problems and not all of the opportunities, then you're getting the wrong picture of India. And so I don't think that the challenges are challenges that are not there, or that these perceptions are unfounded, but they are very limited, as you have indicated, against the backdrop of all of what has changed or evolved and the opportunity that's there. So that is part of what we try to do at USIBC, is try to be that that voice on the U.S.-India corridor that both articulates where some of the remaining challenges are that need to be addressed, and tries to articulate how big of the opportunity that is there. What I used to say when I was at the State Department and companies would say they were dipping their toe in, I said, stop dipping your toe in and dive in, because if you wait for the water to get warm, you'll find the pool is so crowded that you can't find any space. So jump in and then try to shape that ecosystem from within, which I think is what you're looking to do, and what many companies are choosing to do right now.
Okay, since there are no further questions, certainly no hands that I saw, we'll end now. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you to the panelists for a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you for a great